Yo, what's up, guys? My name's Thomas, and I'm about to tell you everything that you need to know from Period 7. So, in the 1890s, Cubans started to get agitated because they couldn't get their freedom from Spain. So, U.S. interest in purchasing Cuba had began long before 1898, when it happened following the 10-Year War. American sugar interests bought up large tracts of land in Cuba. Alterations in the U.S. sugar tariff favoring homegrown beet sugar came straight from Cuba, starting in about 1895. By that time, the U.S. had more than $50 million invested in Cuba in annual trade, mostly in sugar though, nothing really else. So now, President Grover Cleveland's proclamation of neutrality on June 12, 1895, it kind of stirred things up, but not really. It wasn't too much to start the war, but wasn't really enough to keep calm. It was just there. But when General Valeriano began implementing a policy of reconcentration that moved the population into central locations guarded by the Spanish troops, that kind of stirred us up. So we started sending letters back between the Spanish and Americans. But I mean, things were they were heated, but nothing really happened. Things began after the USS Maine exploded. That was when the Spanish invaded Cuba and we lost. Psych, we didn't lose. The war really ended when Spanish agreed to grant independence to Cuba and hand over Guam, Puerto Rico, and Philippines to the United States of America. The year is 1914. World War I begins. Gavrilo Princip killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary, like many other countries in the world, thought that it was the Serbian government that attacked them. The Serbians started talking to Russia, which eventually led up to an alliance, which then said, if you attack Austria, we will help you and we'll fight Germany. So that meant Germany would have to be on the same side as Austria-Hungary, which they had no problem in doing. So Austria got assurance from Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany would support their cause in the event of a Russian intervention, which would likely involve Russia's allies as France and possibly Great Britain as well. The year is 1917. The U.S. enters World War I. It was Germany's policy of unchecked submarine aggression against shipping interests headed to Great Britain from the Americans. It was a ship called the Lusitania. In May 1915, it was sunk by Germany. So, in February 1917, Congress passed a $250 million arms appropriations bill intended to make the United States ready for war. April 2nd, President Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress and called a declaration of war against Germany. World War I ends. Germany had formally surrendered on November 11, 1989, and all nations had agreed to stop fighting while the terms of peace were negotiated. And the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, which this amendment provoked the government's law against women not being able to vote. It stated that all Americans, no matter the sex, shall be able to vote. In 1921, Washington's Naval Conference was a meeting in which all the naval power met in Washington. They met there to discuss how to help release tensions in East Asia after World War I, because there was still tensions in that, people wanted to invade people. And so Japanese militarism began to rise. So the United States decided to jump into the naval arms race, which meant that our Navy would be strongest and it'd be the most powerful. That way, when we needed something at sea, we had the best things. So it's 1929. Stock market crashes. That's a pretty big thing. Suddenly dramatic decline of stock prices across a significant cross-section of a stock market, resulting in a significant loss of wealth. Which meant if you were wealthy, you weren't really going to be wealthy anymore, because any stock that you had invested would now be way less, which then led to the Great Depression. The Great Depression had a lot of things that happened during it. It would happen in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, there were a bunch of banks. The banks started closing, so people would go to them to try to get their money, but there would be no money to save. Like, the bank had no guaranteed money. So let's say you had $1,000 in there and you wanted to pull it all out the next day before the bank made a so-called run. Well, you wouldn't really be able to do that because the bank had no money because they had to file bankruptcy. So therefore, the government had to come in, start giving people food. There were no jobs or anything. So after that, in the 1930s, there was also the Harlem Renaissance, which took place in New York, where the Negro movement happened, where jazz started to bloom. A bunch of writers and artists all came together and to form a nice black community culture. So during this time period, Theodore Roosevelt was elected president, and he implemented the New Deal. This is a new concept brought up when Theodore Roosevelt was elected into office during his term. It introduced a political realignment to the Democratic Party to where it was the majority. A lot of people didn't like that because, there was two parties at the time. There was Democratic and Republican. So just making the Democratic Party the majority, a lot of people didn't agree because if you were Republican, that meant that you didn't have a say on anything. So the year is 1940 and World War II has begun. Hitler came to rise because no one else wanted to. They were also going through a Great Depression like the United States was before. He proposed a theory that the Great Depression in Germany was caused by the Jews. So he took his anger out on them, killing a total of about 11 million, including Jews, blacks, and even if you were gay, you were gonna die. Pretty much everyone, unless you were white with blue eyes and blonde hair. But they also were really close with Japan at the time. 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, blowing up 20 American naval vessels, including 8 enormous battleships and almost 200 airplanes. More than 2,000 American soldiers and sailors died in that attack, and another 1,000 were wounded. The day after the assault, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Congress approved his declaration, dissenting vote. 3 days later, Japanese allied Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States, and again Congress reciprocated. More than 2 years into the conflict, America had finally joined World War II. The year is 1944, and the invasion of Normandy was happening, where the Western Allied forces in Normandy during Operation Overlord in 1944, the largest invasion to ever take place. It was also known as D-Day. Allied land forces that saw combat on Normandy that day came from Canada, the Free French forces, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In the weeks following the invasion, the Polish forces also participated, as well as from Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and even the Netherlands, provided air and naval support, as did the Royal Australian Air Force. In Normandy, 425 Allied and German troops were killed. That's a lot. In 1945, the war in Europe ended with an invasion of Germany by the Western Allies in the Soviet Union, culminating in the capture of Berlin by Soviet and Polish troops and the subsequent German unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, which then ended World War II. In 1945, at the Yalta Conference, the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin all met up to decide what to do with Germany after World War II. The Allies would be allowed liberated peoples to have their own governments. Reparations were to be paid in full. The Allies would agree to establish an international governing body, and Russia would enter the war against Japan. So the year is 1945. And World War II is beginning to come to an end. But we still haven't forgot about Japan. So you know what we decided to do? We decided to drop a nuclear bomb to, so to say, get back at them. And we dropped it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended up killing about 80,000 and permanently radiation damaging another few thousand people, which then later results in Japan surrendering later that year.